what do you see as the most significant challenges and opportunities in the future of infrastructure development?
Such an important question right now. So I think there are two things that are at play in a huge way right now. One is technology and the appropriate use of technology in our field. There are a lot of new things being developed all the time at a much faster pace.
Did you know that by 2030, the world will need to invest an estimated $94 trillion in infrastructure? That's a staggering number, and it really makes you think about where we're headed with our cities and our communities. With an ever-evolving landscape, our expert guest for today, Marsha Anderson Bomar, Global President-elect of AICP and Strategic Transportation Advisor with Ph.D., she's going to share some insights on the most significant challenges and opportunities in the future of infrastructure development and the vital role of the American Society of Civil Engineers, or AICP, in driving innovation and advocating for sustainable practices. My name is Anthony Fasano, and I am the host of the AEC Leadership Podcast, previously the Engineering Career Coach. Let's do it. Now let me welcome our guest onto the show for today. Marsha Anderson Bomar is the Global President-elect for AICP. She's also a Strategic Transportation Advisor at Ph.D. Marsha, welcome to the AEC Leadership Podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
So Marsha, just to get us started, maybe you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself and kind of your career journey in transportation engineering, just kind of taking us through it, giving us like the overall journey.
Sure. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and had the great good fortune to be raised in an environment that really encouraged education and exploration. Because back in the days when I was a child, girls didn't really receive a lot of encouragement to pursue careers, and certainly not careers in, just the math and science areas. But I decided when I was in high school, I had been so good in math and not as good in science, but okay in science. I wasn't exactly sure what engineering was, but there was something about it that really spoke to me, and wanted to go into engineering. I actually did my first degree in math at an engineering college because I was a little bit nervous that maybe I wasn't well prepared to be in engineering. So it took me a couple of degrees to get to my civil engineering degree, but I eventually got my master's in engineering, in civil engineering from Princeton University, and then worked for a while as a consultant in the New York, New Jersey area where I grew up, but then moved to Atlanta for family reasons and did some consulting on my own, worked for another consulting firm, and maybe at another time we can talk about why I left there. But I ultimately jumped into and started my own consulting business, which I ran for 20 years, a little more than 20 years, grew to about 120 people on staff, and ultimately sold to Stantec. Worked with Stantec for about 5 years, focusing really heavily in the area of sustainability. And then decided I had always had a heart for public service. So I saw this as an opportunity to move into that world. So my first job in the public sector was as the executive director of a community improvement district, the largest one in the state of Georgia. Served in that role for about 3 years when I got a call from the then general manager of MARTA, the transit system in Atlanta. And he asked me to come on board to be the assistant general manager for capital programs. So I jumped over there and did that for about 3 years. And then I got a call from the mayor's office at the city of Atlanta, and they asked me to come and serve as the commissioner of transportation at the relatively newly formed Atlanta DOT. That position, I decided I was very anxious and willing to do it, but I knew I didn't want to do it for a very long time. So I accepted the position as an interim and encouraged the mayor to continue looking for a permanent person who is now in place. And I stayed on board almost a year and a half as the commissioner, and then a little over a year as they called me Commissioner Emeritus, kind of helping hands. I served as Deputy Commissioner of Engineering, kind of plugged in wherever they needed some help. So I decided that I didn't want to work full time anymore. And so I left there and through some contacts and relationships, have now joined G.H.D, which is an international consultancy serving in a part-time role as a strategic transportation advisor.
And that is the life of a civil engineer in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, yeah. With
No,
one other little piece that I want to share. So, as I mentioned, I had a heart for service, and so long before I sold my company, I really wanted to at least put a toe in the water of public service. So, at the time, the only thing I could think of was to serve in an elected position. So I ran for and was successful gaining a seat in our local city council and had the great honor of serving there for after 16 years. I served 4 terms on the city council. It served as what they call mayor pro tem. So my husband used to call it mayor pretend. So when the mayor is not available, you get to serve as the mayor. And so I did that for 16 years while I was doing all the other engineering things. It was great
well,
opportunity.
that's great. And I know you didn't mention it, but I know you also, I believe, started up a foundation to help women in engineering at Georgia Tech. Is that correct?
Well, I didn't start. We endowed a foundation at Georgia.
Doubt it.
My company actually had a foundation that we didn't exclusively use for women in engineering, but largely did things to serve that population. But I was on the board of the Women in Engineering program at Georgia Tech and had an opportunity to endow what they call their M&M program, the Mentor and Mentee program. And so very proud that we were able to do that. And it lives on to this day.
That's great. So if you're a civil engineer and you're listening, you're thinking, what could I do in my career? You just heard about a lot of different things that you could do. And it really is interesting. I mean, Marsha, obviously going from kind of starting a business, growing a business, selling it, going on with a large private organization like a Stantec, then getting into the public sector, really has had the opportunity to see a lot of, serve as a civil engineer in a lot of different roles, which I think is really, really exciting. And that's kind of what we're going to, learn more about all that today. And I guess where I'd like to start, Marsha, is what do you see as the most significant challenges and opportunities in the future of infrastructure development?
Such an important question right now. So I think there are 2 things that are at play in a huge way right now. One is technology and the appropriate use of technology in our field. There are a lot of new things being developed all the time at a much faster pace. I mean, I come from the generation where computers took up an entire floor of the building and you typed a deck of cards and handed them in to now where, I carry this around and I've got a much more powerful computer in my very hand. So I've lived through a lot of technology change, but the pace now is so fast and there's so many good things, but there are also cautions along the way. AI has been a very hot topic, certainly within engineering, and what role does AI play? I think we need to lead that effort in civil engineering. We need to be very thoughtful about how we use it. There are issues of accuracy because it's only as good as the information that's put in. So we need the bright minds of the civil engineers to be the guardians of what goes into a system. They also have to be the guardians and the intelligence reviewing what comes out of those things, just as we've done with any computer program that we've ever used. There's also opportunity there because well done, those tools can help us to expand our effectiveness, the pace at which we can do work, perhaps even the accuracy of some of the work that we do. I think we are still the creative souls in civil engineering. I don't think machines are going to take our place in that part. But I think there's a very important connection to the other thing that's happening right now is the population is shrinking. The number of people going into engineering is shrinking a little bit. The workforce is not as robust as it needs to be.
Mm.
So how do we use these tools wisely and effectively to help us perhaps make up for some of the gaps that we have in having enough people to do all the work that's in front of us. Infrastructure is just so important.
Yeah, I think what you've said is kind of really hits it in that AI. Initially, when you think about it, you're like, wow, the opportunities are limitless. But at the same time, I think back to when I was a young civil engineer doing stormwater design, and my manager always used to tell me when we used the program modeling, garbage in equals garbage out. So I think I think it's going to be great, and there's a lot of potential opportunities, like you said, where it can really help us if it's done right, be successful, and maybe help to close the gap where there's not enough civil engineers to do all the work out there. So if we have skilled civil engineers and some really good AI, and we put the two together, good things can happen. The question becomes, how do we put them together the right way, right? And that's I think what we're kind of up against going forward here. And so I guess kind of along those lines, maybe we can talk a little bit about, in terms of infrastructure and, ASC, I think, has been really good about getting the word out about infrastructure, the report card, all the great things that they do. But generally speaking, like, how do you envision the role of technology and innovation in really transforming our infrastructure systems over the next decade? Like, what changes do you think we'll see?
So I think there are going to be more changes in materials and in methods than we've seen in the past. I think that technology has some unique opportunities. We're even looking at that, for example, in some of our student competitions. It's pretty hard to move a concrete canoe from one side of the country to the other,
Right.
you know? But what if we did a 3D printed canoe that you could print when you got to the site of the competition, you know? So we need to be open to possibilities and think about the types of infrastructure that we're building. I've had numerous conversations, for example, 'cause I'm in transportation. So we know we have flexible pavements. Why don't we have technology in the pavement that while it is flexing, it's charging a battery? And maybe the electric vehicles that are driving on that road, on that infrastructure, can recharge their batteries from the electricity that's generated by those vibrations. So, I think those are some of the paths that are just wide open in front of us for exploration.
Mm.
And I think if you looked at every aspect of civil engineering, you could find examples like that.
It's funny, I'm thinking about maybe it was 8 or 10 years ago, I went to the ASC National Conference, which was in New York City that year, and I remember all the concrete canoes there, and I'm just imagining if someone would have said to all those students, "In 10 years from now, you're gonna be printing these things on site," what they would have thought.
Yeah.
But you're right, yeah, it's gonna really change everything, and I think it's gonna allow for changes to happen faster when we need them to, which can also be valuable in, our world of civil engineering and infrastructure where, time can certainly be of the essence in certain situations where it's needed. So let's talk a little bit about ASC. I introduced Marsha earlier as the global president-elect for ASC, and I almost had to catch myself saying national president-elect, but ASC has become more and more global, of course, over the years, and they're doing things worldwide now, which is exciting. But in terms of ASC, how do you see ASC's role evolving to address, some of these emerging needs of our infrastructure that we've already talked about here?
So I think one of the many, many strengths of ASCE is in our leadership role, we have been great collaborators and conveners. So I think we alone can solve some of the problems in front of us, but I think we are better when we're working collaboratively with others. So for example, if we did not have as strong an advocacy program as we have, I think that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act might not have happened. If you look at the number of times that the report card is cited in that document, in that piece of legislation, I think it's pretty clear that we've been influential in raising the profile, the needs of good infrastructure in this country. So I think there are many examples that I could give where ASCE has been that strong voice, that convener of others who need to get behind the idea of better infrastructure for this country. We're doing it right now relative to workforce issues. We are not the only ones who are struggling, not having a large enough workforce to do all we've got all this great money now. Where is the workforce to get all of that work done? Whether
Right.
it's just the engineers or the engineers and the technicians who support the engineering work, the contractors, the people who construct our work. We're all struggling with a shortage of human capital. ASCE has convened a group that has now signed a memo of understanding. Some other engineering groups, some other collaborators in our space have gotten together because we have to tackle this together. We can't be fighting each other and stealing from each other. We need to find a real solution. So I think that's a big strength of ASCE and bringing together the right people around important issues and coming up with good solutions.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the advocacy. When I graduated as a civil engineer, and I don't think it was until maybe in my 30s that I even understood what advocacy or policy or any of that even meant. I was just head down doing calculations and reports. And I think ASC has done a really good job in recent years talking more about that, doing the legislative fly ins and things of that nature, getting civil engineers involved and active. And of course, the report cards. We've done several podcast interviews with ASCE members that have worked on the infrastructure report cards across the country in the different states. And to Marsha's point, being it was a factor, in the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. I mean, it was cited many times, and I think that's important because ASC does a lot of great things, but I'm afraid that still some of the younger members maybe don't know so much about the policy and the advocacy that goes into just engineering in general. And so I think it's a good thing for you to get involved with as early as you can in your career. There's many of opportunities through ASCE to do it. Get involved with your report card within your state, in your in your local section or chapter. Not only that, I think, and I've heard this from everyone, I'm sure Marsha will agree. Once you get active in these associations and you get on committees and take leadership positions, that's when it can become really satisfying and you really get to meet other people and engage with them and do some great things.
Absolutely, that is so true. And I'm so glad you talked a little bit more about the report card because 2025 is the year for the new report card. So this year in March, just the day before the fly-in, we will have the big reveal of the new report card. It's moving along. The process is moving along well. They're putting together all the support materials right now. We have a huge opportunity to get up on the Hill that very week and educate the newly electeds or those returning, get them acquainted with ASCE, but also get them acquainted with the tool that they now have in their hands, which will be the new report card.
That's great. No, that's exciting. And I hope with all this infrastructure funding and if we can marry AI and civil engineers and we get everything going, that the report card grades can start to improve over time.
Yeah, well, that you raise a good point. We all know how long infrastructure takes to get on the ground,
Yes.
so to speak. So it's not surprising that even though money has been flowing, projects take a while to roll out. So I would not expect to see as much improvement this time as we will, I'm sure, see 4 years from now when the next
Right.
report card comes out, and many of these projects are actually bricks and mortar.
Yeah, and if you're sitting out there listening to this wondering why the report cards are every 4 years, the amount of work that goes into these report cards is tremendous. I've had a couple of people on the show talk about it from specific states. I mean, they're literally going out to every structure in the state, inspecting it, looking at it, taking pictures, getting information to build this report card. It's not something that they take lightly or do quickly. So it's a really kind of robust and detailed process, as it should be, of course. And so that when they present it, it's really indicative of what's going on in that state, which is important. Again, if it's going back to, for legislation and for other things, it's being utilized and leaned on. And also with the Jobs Act, I think also that the funds are being, also dripped out over years, right? So I think between the funds being dripped out, and like Marsha said, infrastructure projects in general just taking time. You put those two things together, it'll take some time, but you have to start now. And these report cards are a really, really big part of that. So, Marsha, a couple of words that we hear often these days when it comes to civil engineering is sustainability and resilience. What can civil engineers do to ensure that these things are happening on projects and in infrastructure in the future? Because I know they're big words and they sound great, but what can we really do about them?
So I think one of the things that we should be doing, all of us as civil engineers, is learning more about what applies in our specific discipline area. What are the tools, what are the opportunities for creating more sustainable or more resilient infrastructure? Because they are a little bit different. ASCE is one of the, again, collaborators for the development of the Envision rating tool. So for those who are not familiar, ASCE, APWA, ACEC, and the Zopnis School for Sustainability at Harvard got together and developed this rating tool. It's sort of like LEED is for vertical infrastructure. This is for horizontal infrastructure. What I think is stronger and better about Envision is that it really explains to you how to move the needle in a particular topical area. There are nominally 60 topical areas it covers. And it really gives you clues out as to how to make incremental improvements. LEED is more of a yes, no. You either achieved this or you didn't. You either, did A or you didn't do A. Whereas Envision gives you ideas about how to make improvements over time to become more sustainable, to become more resilient in the infrastructure. I think one of the challenges that we face, and I think there are some solutions, people think that as soon as you start bringing in those principles, projects are more expensive. And that's not always the case, particularly if you start from the very beginning and plan into your projects to accomplish some of those goals. A lot of the cost comes in because it's an afterthought, and we all know about change orders, and we all know about, when you have a project in development and you're 2/3 of the way through the design documents, and then somebody comes up with a great idea that maybe addresses the sustainability of the project or the resiliency of the project. If you have to backtrack, now you're incurring all kinds of extra costs. But if it's part of your discussion, if it's part of your vocabulary from the very beginning, I think you have a huge opportunity to introduce some concepts into your plans without driving the cost up. We're also at ASCE having conversations with both the finance community and the insurance community, because I think they totally understand the concepts of sustainability and resilience. And I think it would go without saying that insurance companies, if they have to pay out to rebuild a piece of infrastructure that has failed because of, a natural disaster or some other, maybe a climate reason, whatever, they'd like to rebuild it once and know that it's going to last, 50 or 100 years. They don't want to rebuild it, have another hurricane, for example, come through, and oops, that infrastructure was built to minimum standards, and now it's gone again, and I have to pay out again to rebuild it. So they're very interested and they're engaged with us. We recently had a conference at ASCE headquarters with those two groups to begin the in-depth conversation for how do we collaborate to make it attractive to invest in infrastructure that is sustainable and resilient. So I think the future's going to be pretty bright in that arena.
Yeah, I think that's important because I do think that sometimes we hear the words and people be like, "Yeah, right, it's not going to happen," type of thing. So hearing that ASCE is really plugged into looking at how it's practically going to happen, and also thinking about budgetary constraints of projects and how it can still work, I think is important. I think talking to the finance and insurance industries is a smart approach. And I think to your point, if it's planned ahead on, right, you can, kind of weave it into your projects more seamlessly and there won't be much of a financial impact. But also, sometimes even if there's a more of an upfront cost, you can talk to your client about the savings over the lifetime of the project, right?
Absolutely. Life
Maintenance,
cycle costs.
life cycle
Absolutely.
costs, things of that nature. And so if you're an engineer, civil engineer out there listening, and you're interested in more sustainability, resiliency, you know, you might have to get creative, but I think that ASCE is doing a good job in trying to make this a more practical endeavor for civil engineers. And I think planning ahead, like Marsha mentioned, on your projects is going to be helpful. And really, again, it comes back to getting involved with organizations like ASCE, where you can connect with other people and learn about these initiatives. Because at the end of the day, anything that we want to bring to the table as a civil engineer to bring value to our clients or communities, we've got to learn about them, right? We need knowledge.
And
So
we have to be open. We have to be, mindful that we each have our own knowledge base. And then maybe there are people who are expert in other aspects, which is why, more and more projects now are really team based. Whereas in my early days, you got a project, you sat at your desk, you did your design, you handed it in, and you were pretty much an island doing your work. And now it's so much more teamwork. And I think there's so much value in all the different ideas that are around that table.
yeah, there's many more pathways for collaboration these days. So I want to talk a little bit about diversity. I think we've come a long way in civil engineering in recent years. There's still a lot of work to do, but we've done well. How can organizations like ASC continue to support and amplify diverse voices in our profession?
So I think the word that came to mind when I thought about that was intentionality. So you have to want to make it a difference that way. You have to be intentional about doing it. You have to pause and think of that. Okay, look around the table. Who's not here? Who should be here? Whose voice, is not being heard right now. ASC is doing some really exciting things that way. We have our own Dr. Lisa Black, who has worn many hats in ASCE, and one of the ones she wears is leading this as a staff person leading our Mosaic group. So we have our initiative, the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative, and on our behalf, she participated in the development of an ISO standard for how to measure diversity and inclusion, how to know we're actually doing good things in that arena. And I had the great good fortune to attend a workshop with her to learn more about that. And then about two weeks ago, ASE had a conference at headquarters with a lot of different panel discussions about these different topics specific to our industry. What is happening in our industry? How are we doing things differently now than we did before? Where are some of the gaps? What are we, what groups are we still not truly incorporating into these conversations and into the workplace? There are laws on the books, but the actual implementation takes time, and it's not always implemented as it was envisioned. So when the Americans with Disabilities Act became a thing, a lot of communities started changing how they designed infrastructure, but they only looked at certain groups of users in that band. They didn't look at all the users of infrastructure. And I think we have a much broader perspective now of who we have to plan to utilize our infrastructure. And I think the critical thing, and we're learning how to do this better as a profession, is including the voices of all of those groups. Because, for example, I have never myself been in a wheelchair. So how do I really know how to design infrastructure that supports somebody who is mobility challenged that way? So, making sure that there are people in our design groups who represent, whether it's reaching out to the community, reaching out to maybe a nonprofit, reaching out to somebody who is that educated voice for that population that we're trying to understand and make sure that we're serving well. I think we're really understanding how to do that a lot better than ever before.
It's interesting because I feel like a theme of our conversation today has been being open to new things, right? Like being open to AI and how to put it together, being open to sustainability, being open to all, different diverse perspectives and opinions. It's kind of something that civil engineering is kind of transforming, if you will. And there's so many new things, and we really need to be open and hear these different things out, which is seems to be every question I ask you. That's kind of part of the
Yeah,
answer.
yeah, and I think part of that is also, those of us at my stage of my career, I have to be open to the fact that, yeah, I have a lot of knowledge, historical knowledge, et cetera. But the young members of our organization, the early and mid-career people really have some knowledge that, you know, I will never have. They have life experiences that I will never have. And people like me also have to be willing to step out of the way and let those bright minds take over and be the ones in charge, be the ones driving the solutions. Because it's their work. We build infrastructure that lasts 50 or 100 years. So I'm no longer building infrastructure for me. I'm building it for my grandchildren and my great grandchildren. So the people who need to have the strongest, loudest voices in these conversations need to be the people who are going to live to see these projects on the ground and use them, use the lakes that are created or the transportation systems that are created, whatever part of the infrastructure world you're in. We need to be very forward thinking and make sure that the people who are going to be the users have a say in what their infrastructure is going to be.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I've always thought that that's such an important aspect of being a civil engineer is, those stakeholders on your projects that are the end users, whether they're the people driving on the road or, living in the community, or you've got to engage with them. And, the earlier on that you can do it in a project life cycle, the better. And to your point, you're designing it for them. So if you want to create the most practical design, which we should as civil engineers, like you said, you've never been in a wheelchair. Talk to someone in a wheelchair. And I think we need to think that way.
And maybe even have somebody on your team, if your organization happens to have somebody who is, is mobility challenged.
Yes. Yeah.
Have that person, if they're not fully on the team, maybe their skill set, whatever they do on a daily basis is not part of the design process, but invite them to come and do a tabletop session with you and let them take a look at the plans and give you feedback, because they have kind of civil engineering mindset, but they also have the other knowledge that you may not have as a designer.
Yeah, that's great. So professional associations, professional organizations, you've obviously been very active and very involved now as the global president-elect for AICE. For those out there, those civil engineers listening that maybe you're just getting involved, consider getting involved, what has it meant to you in your career? Can you talk about how your involvement in professional associations has benefited you?
Sure. And let me go back to kind of the very beginning. So I got a master's degree in transportation planning and engineering. I was in school in 1974, 75. And everybody in my program joined an organization called the Institute of Transportation. Well, at the time it was the Institute of Traffic Engineers. Later it became the Institute of Transportation Engineers. And everybody joined. And so I joined. I went to my first meeting. I didn't know a soul. As always, I was the only woman. And I was very fortunate because two of the members came up to me, introduced themselves, invited me to sit at their table. It was a dinner meeting, invited me to sit with them. We are lifelong friends, from that very moment that they welcomed me to the organization. Over the years, I actually had the great honor of serving as as president of that organization. I was the first woman to serve as president of that organization quite some time ago. It's 30 years ago now that I served as president of that organization. The relationships that I built, lifelong relationships, have helped me, with projects, have helped me with introductions. I did work all around the country, all around the world. So if I didn't know somebody someplace, I knew somebody who knew somebody there. Same thing with ASCE. I was active in ASCE for a while. I did take a break from ASCE for a little bit, came back with such a passion for the organization that from, the very first day I came back, I volunteered to serve on some committees. I was ultimately elevated to chair some things and to serve ultimately on the Transportation and Development Institute board. Had the honor of serving as president of that. And I've loved all of the organizational activities. They gave me a chance to fine-tune my leadership skills in a safe environment. It gave me the chance to meet a lot of different people, which always opens doors. You never know quite which door or when, but the friendships that you make, the relationships that you build, you may move to a new part of the country. You'll never be alone. There will be ASCE members there the minute you walk in, your family. So there are so many different ways in which being engaged in an organization, ASCE not only covers the United States, but we have a strong global presence now as well. So whether you're doing work or traveling within the US or around the world, you have colleagues there, you have friends there. And it makes the world a better place when you have those relationships.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, a lot of times people think about your career as like, hey, how many projects did you get done and so on and so forth. But I also like to think of it how many people you met and, how you enjoyed your career and built great relationships. And I know the associations, speaking from my own experience, and you just described it as well, is they help you to fill your career with these rewarding relationships that are friends, not just colleagues that you work with, which I think is really special. And I think one other thing about it that I found to be important is we can put our head down as engineers and just work every day if we want, all day long on projects. But when we have something to go to, like we have a committee meeting to go to at night, right? It really forces us and pushes us to kind of get out of our comfort zone, get out in the community and meet people. And I've always enjoyed that accountability factor for myself to say, hey, I committed to this, so I'm going to do it and follow through on it. So I think it's a great way to really get yourself involved in the community.
And I just want to go back to the comment I made about being a safe space because, at work, you're worried that everything you are doing, you're judged in one way, shape, or form for your actions. So sometimes you're a little bit shy about stepping forward because you don't want to make a mistake. You don't want to do something that's going to harm your career. In a volunteer environment, everybody comes around you. So if you volunteer to do something, if you don't really know how to do it, there are people there who will help you. If you do something and it's not quite right, there are people who come around you and help you fix it. So it had that opportunity to give you the time to grow your leadership skills, to grow your confidence in a way that in your workplace you just can't necessarily get the same experience.
Yeah, I like that. That's really valuable for someone, I'm sure, in their career. Definitely. So, Marsha, the last question that I want to ask you is for those engineers out there, whether they're starting their careers or they're, building their careers, and they really want to make a meaningful impact in their field, what advice can you kind of give them based on your career and what you've seen?
So I kind of think of it in two parts. One is don't just sit at your desk and do your work. When you're sitting at your desk, do a great job, always do excellent work, but don't let that be all that it's about. Whether it's walking over to somebody else in the office who's working on something interesting and asking some questions, shadowing them a little bit, maybe learning about what they're doing, maybe looking to somebody who is doing the job that you think you'd like to do one day and learning more about what their job is and what their path was to get there. Don't just be a bystander. Don't just sit and heads down, do your great engineering work. It also applies to helping you kind of become a little bit more bold in your pursuit of doing great engineering work. We all want to work on projects that we get excited about. People won't know what your passion is if you don't talk about it. People won't know what you want next, where your creative energy is, if you don't get out there and talk about it. So whether it's within your company or within your ASCE, family, whether it's a committee or a section or a chapter or a branch, kind of talk about what matters to you. You never know what ears are listening. You never know who's sitting at the table who can be the person to rate their hand and say, you know what, I have something going on that aligns with what you're interested in. Why don't you come alongside of me and help me? And maybe a natural mentoring relationship comes out of that. So I urge people to find something outside of just doing your daily good work and lift your head up and get involved. Hopefully it's something within the ASCE world. We have so many different ways you can get engaged with ASCE. Hopefully it's something within that sphere. But I think it's really important to be the best you that you can be, is to put yourself out there a little bit more in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speak up, voice your opinions, put information out there, and you'll find the right people that'll come and kind of grab onto that stuff and help you and, be a friend, be a fellow stakeholder. And ASC does have a ton of initiatives. We talked about a few of them today here, like the report card is something you can easily get active in locally. They're always looking for people to help. Again, you can, go to asc.org, or if you're already a member, you can check with your local section. But once again, Marsha Anderson Bomar. Marsha is the global president-elect for ASCE. She's also strategic transportation advisor at H.ITE. Marsha, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us here on the AEC Leadership Podcast.
Well, thank you again. I really enjoyed the time together.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Marsha. She is a dynamic leader. She's done a lot, and she gave us a lot of time here, and hope that you can take some of her advice and apply it in your career. Please consider subscribing to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.